Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker today, Time Magazine says, is truly one of the most important people in the world. Now, we've had some people speak in our class who are not in that category. This man is in that category, and I can truly say that.
Don't believe Time Magazine.
People all over the world listen. So we're here to listen to you. Jeffery.
David. Wow. Well, thank you for what you're doing, David, and what all of you are doing. I feel with that with that introduction, you should be giving the talk because you're the ones that have been out there and are out there in public service, and public service is extraordinarily important for a lot of things, including the subject that I'm going to talk about. And I think since I see a couple copies of the book around, I think some people have probably looked at it, so I'm not going to give a whole lecture. Also, we're going to have a discussion, is my understanding. I wrote the book because I think that we need to do some important things in the world and can do some important things in the world right now, probably with a unique opportunity for your generation of leadership. And I give a timetable, so it is like an extended homework assignment, in fact, and that is maybe it's a midterm. The midterm is to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. The final exam is to end poverty by the year 2025. These are objectives that have not been front and center of the American public policy for a while. President Kennedy said in his inaugural address that to the people in the Hudson villages around the world, and I'm only paraphrasing, we stand with you and will be with you in your fight against poverty. And he said at the time, interestingly, it's not because this is against communism, it's because it's the right thing to do. And this is the sentiment that I think we really need to recapture in this country. And perhaps unlike 1960, we can actually bring that effort to a fully successful conclusion, given a lot of good things that have happened between 1961, January 20th, and now. And that is that the share of the world living in extreme poverty has declined significantly. And the power of our tools to do something about extreme poverty have multiplied enormously. When President Kennedy spoke, we hadn't yet had a green revolution. India looked unable to feed itself. China, of course, seemed in the throes of chaos. It was actually in 1961 still at the tail end of the Great Leap Forward, probably the greatest human-induced famine in history, in fact, with 20 or 30 million people perishing because of the insanity of Mao's mismanagement and arrogance and totalitarian control. So at the time when President Kennedy uttered those words, probably even with all the hard work in the world, unlike going to the moon and back safely within a decade, the president could not have promised that at the end of one generation, extreme poverty could have been eliminated. But I think a president today could promise that, and I think if we had a president who would promise that, incidentally, we would ignite the world with hope and with enthusiasm and with leadership and with a million more ideas than I could come up with in my book. And that's what we really need right now is entrepreneurship and energy and excitement and a realization of that if we think hard about these issues, if we understand how rich we are, if we understand how much we actually do know already, though we don't know everything we need to know, we could have tremendous success. I actually believe, David, that the mood is changing in this country a lot, and I'm feeling, and I don't think it's just my own optimism or hearing my wonderful eloquence in my ear, you know, because I probably do like to hear myself talk. I actually do feel that there's a change underway in this country. you're probably exactly the exemplars of that, of energetic and idealistic and realistic people that want to make a difference. I'm speaking all over the country these months, both because of the book and also because of my advisory role with Kofi Annan. I've just finished, because of the launch of the paperback, a kind of desk front tour of the country by radio talk shows, probably a couple of dozen in the last couple of weeks. And so that also gives you a feeling out there. Are the questions hard-edged? When the callers call in, what do they say? And I cannot tell you how the mood is, first, some frustration. Second, a dramatic realization that we're on the wrong course right now in foreign policy, which I deeply believe, and which I think is something that the public is coming to understand. I think the public was scared, and when we're scared, we will follow our leader wherever the leader goes. That's probably, in some sense, a healthy response. It's also a very deep-seated human response, because when you're fearful, you know we need to coalesce, and if our elected leader says go this way, we're very likely to go that particular way. But I think the American people, I don't know if they always can figure it out with forethought, but they're very pragmatic also, and they see, gee, this isn't working. And the military approach to our problems is not going to give us security. I can also tell you that I was visited recently by a major general from the European Command, and the European Command in Stuttgart is our military headquarters that has operational responsibility for security vis-a-vis 47 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, I think is the count. There are a few countries that are part of Central Command, but the European Command has most of Central and West Africa. And the general came and he opened his laptop and said, do you mind if I show you a PowerPoint presentation? And he showed me a presentation about Africa that I might have written in my more radical moments, frankly. It was started out basically saying that the way we're going, we're setting in place the next generation of violence and instability, and that there is no way in the world that a military approach can ever address this, that the only way to make for stability in Africa is to fight hunger. And a hungry generation is never going to be a stable generation. This is from Major General of the European Command. It gives you actually a tremendous amount of confidence in our institutions, more than I sometimes get from our immediate leadership. But I think the general is right, that, and I think the American people are right, that we need a different approach, and I think your public service can contribute a lot to that. Now, I also believe that what is really needed in this is a combination of the human heart and the human brain. We have to have a good analytical framework and a good understanding of what the underlying problems are. And I don't think we're quite there yet, because it's not simple and it's not one thing. And part of the theme of my book is to argue for a kind of diagnostic approach to understand these problems better, and even a new kind of training. And that's relevant for a new school, I suppose, also. I talk about the idea of clinical economics for my own profession as a new way to study economics. It's not the way I was trained in economics. I was trained in the classroom with problem sets, and was trained with good theory and wonderful conceptual tools, but I was not trained to look at a real economy and diagnose it and try to understand what the actual problems were. And it was only after I was, certified to know things, which I realized afterwards I didn't know, that I began work as an advisor to governments in 1985. And I came to understand that I had had half an education, not really a full education. I hadn't actually been even told how to approach practical problems. I had only been told about how to approach conceptual or theoretical problems. And I hadn't had also the practical experience or the clinical experience that a medical student gets. So I've learned a lot, as I say, from my wife, who's a pediatrician and a clinician, and I've watched her do 1,000 phone calls in the middle of the night about sick children and how she handles it, and it's part of the thinking in here. So we need a clear head as well as a good heart, I think, to get this right. And we need to be able to make a diagnostic of the challenges of poverty in different parts of the world against a good theoretical knowledge, but with the ability to understand the practical conditions and challenges as well. And I made a little bit of a PowerPoint that I thought would be useful. It's the one that I'm using to try to explain what I'm seeing right now. And perhaps if we could just go through that. I don't know if someone can hit the arrow each time. I want to show you about, can that, yeah, and I don't know if you can you knock off the little box? Yeah, thanks. Okay, yeah, maybe it's to hit down below then. Yeah, that one. Lower, lower, lower. Up, 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 up. That's it. Got it. Okay. Yeah. So if you could just advance it. Let me explain to you what I'm seeing in the very poorest part of the world and why it's horrific on the one side and on the other hand, why it's solvable. Because there's no point in minimizing the extent of crisis right now. It's worse than you know. But it's actually more solvable, vastly more solvable than it looks. And that's the paradox. It's both terrible and getting worse, and yet readily solvable. And it's fitting to say all of this with Heifer International around the corner because they're on exactly the same wavelength. And they gave me earlier today this nice book I recommended reading for my graduate students now also. Beatrice's goat, but the theme of this is that one goat changed the life of this household, and that's actually literally an analytical point of importance, which is you can be in a downward spiral, and a tiny bit of help can put you on a positive path of development. If you want to put it in mathematical terms, there's a bifurcation. That's not what's said here. What's said here is that a goat can make a big difference, and it's absolutely rigorously true, this story. And it's the point that just because something's horrendous doesn't mean it's unsolvable. You have to understand what are the drivers and what can be done about it. This is a scene that I saw in January in Zamba Central Hospital in southern Malawi. And it's children, most of whom are in coma from malaria. They've been brought to this hospital too late probably to be saved. And the hospital is overrun with hundreds of dying children and 70 beds and maybe one nurse for the ward or a couple of nurses. It's an absolutely shocking and horrendous situation. That's a child in coma from malaria. The parasite gets into the brain's capillaries and ends up killing the child. And child's on intravenous, may be saved, may not be saved. You don't know. Best estimate is that 2 to 3 million children will die this year of malaria. Now, malaria is a mosquito-transmitted disease. that can be substantially prevented by a $7 bed net. So, and the bed net lasts 5 years, and 2 children sleep under it. So it's about 70 cents per child per year. So the deep puzzle of our world, in my view, is how is it that 98% of the children at risk don't have a bed net? And this isn't the #1 issue for us. I actually don't have an answer for that, so if you want me to explain the world, I can't. I've been now for 7 years trying to do something about this, and I and others have made some progress, but it is amazing to me, frankly, that in the shadow of all of the disasters of the past century, that we can't get organized to get these bed nets to these children. There's no really deep explanation for it. The people want them. They've been proved to be effective. They're rather straightforwardly produced. And yet it's not been on anybody's priority list. And it's really a shock. It's paradigmatic of a broader set of issues, but even aside from being paradigmatic of bigger issues, it itself is a huge issue. I was raised to believe that 2 to 3 million lives per year counted for something. I really was. And I grew up to learn that it's not quite so simple. It's estimated that 8 to 10 million children will die of readily preventable and treatable diseases this year. That's a lot, you know? It ought to be enough actually to do something about. And there is, I can tell you, I've studied this problem now for 10 years, there is no good explanation, and there's no excuse. There's nothing too hard about it. There's nothing too expensive about it. There's nothing too unimportant about it. There's actually no really deep explanation. There are a lot of pseudo-explanations. You can't do this, you can't do that, and they're not true. And I couldn't understand how such untruths could continue to circulate, and it actually, again, took me a while because I'm slow off the mark. These are not things I figure out in a classroom. They're things I figure out from experience. I realized that almost everybody that was telling me these things had never stepped foot in a village, knew nothing, and it was their job to explain why something couldn't be done because that's what the budget was. So given that the budget wasn't to do anything about it, they had to come up with a good explanation. And there's probably some human instinct in that also, but there's some political instinct in it as well. I can tell you, I'm summarizing thousands of pages of literature and experience on malaria control. I just want to tell you, there's no reason for this. Let me show you another, and then I'm going to get a little bit more analytical. This is another aspect of the struggle to stay alive of the billion or so people in extreme poverty. Water, safe drinking water and water for irrigation is one of the pivotal issues for the poor. Understand that the poor overwhelmingly, maybe 3/4 or 4/5 are rural and generally subsistence farmers. That's where most of the world's poor are. They live in poor communities in rural areas and generally grow food for their own survival. And so all of the things that go into that, living in an environment that is filled with pathogens, parasitic disease, filled with risks of water, soils, land degradation, environmental hazards, that's the life of the poorest of the poor. About 1/4 of the world's poorest of the poor live in urban slums. That's, for some people, what first comes to mind. That's a minority. There are a lot of issues to discuss about the urban poor, but a lot of the essential underpinnings of the urban poor is rural poverty. These are people that have streamed in from the countryside because there's no food, because there's violence in the countryside. And more often than not, the violence in the countryside is the result of hunger and extreme deprivation in the countryside, not fundamentally violence as the prime mover. And it's interesting, even Nicholas Kristof, who's I admire and is a good friend. If you read his New York Times column, he's been writing a lot about Darfur and the crisis in the Sudan. And I'm very happy that he's doing it, of course, but in a way it's a little bit misleading on two counts. He's leaving the impression again that most of the poor are suffering because of violence and the bloody-mindedness of their leaders, and that's actually not the case. Most of the poor are suffering because they don't grow enough food, because the mosquitoes are biting them, because the rain isn't coming, and so forth. And so it's not just war and terrible tyrants, which is so much of our image these days, as if it's all about military issues. And second, even Darfur itself, in my estimation, though I'm not an expert on it, but I'm an amateur on Darfur, it started as an ecological crisis. It started in the 1980s when the land could no longer accommodate the camel and cattle herdsmen and the sedentary farmers at the same time. And this fight is between different ethnic groups, those who are migratory farmers, what are called pastoralists, and the sedentary farmers. And in essence, I believe that's an ecological crisis, not a political crisis. All of these things turn into a political and a military crisis, but they start out with hunger, and they start out with water shortage. What you're seeing there is a picture of men digging in a dry riverbed. It's a very unusual scene. That's why I continue to look at it, because it's not something I would have ever expected had I not seen it with my own eyes that day. This is a village where we're working in Ethiopia, and the village is there in part because there's a river. The only problem is there's no more water in the river. The rains have failed in the short rains for the last 6 years now, and probably upstream there's also probably water withdrawals from the river, although I don't know really what's happening hydrologically upstream. But by the time the river comes to this area, there's no water in it. And on this day, the men were out in the riverbed with their shovels digging a hole in the middle of the riverbed to get to the water table, which you can see is something like a meter below the surface. It's kind of shocking, the idea that to stay alive you dig in the middle of your dry river to find the water, to carry the water up to the crops. But this is the real life. Now in this village, the women spend 6 hours a day often just to collect the drinking water. It's an hour in the morning to the drinking, and what's there is something awful. You know, you wouldn't let it pass your child's lips once, much less every day. It's little rivulet coming from a little spring that they're scooping with the dirt into the water bottle. They walk an hour there, they walk an hour back, they walk an hour there midday, walk an hour back, they walk an hour there in the evening, they walk an hour back. That's life. The life is a struggle to survive. But if you put a borehole down, then maybe the water's actually right there in the center of the village for a few $100s, and you free up essentially a whole lifetime of villagers all over so that they can do something else and earn income and get out of poverty. So a well can be like Beatrice's goat also. Small things can make a huge difference by enabling people to shift from the desperate fight to stay alive to economically, let's say financially productive activity. In other words, where you actually earn cash income and can begin investing for the future. So Let me very quickly take you through a little of an analysis. One more picture I forgot. This is the latest map. I just was stunned by it. This is the UN's map of where there are food emergencies in Africa now. You know, why don't they just show us where there aren't food emergencies? Basically, we now have a continent where there's just food emergency pervasive throughout the continent. And incidentally, the tropics defines a lot of the area of crisis in the world. So the northern African countries are really quite different. And the southernmost countries of Africa are temperate zone, and they're also quite different. It's the tropical band where most of the world's poverty is. And within that tropical band, it's smallholder farmers, typically in what's called the savanna climate, which is the kind of climate where you have a rainy season followed by a dry season, followed by a rainy season, followed by a dry season. That's India, and that's Africa, and that's where the vast majority of the poor live today. So what can be done about it? If you could hit the button. In my view, there are three great transformations that simultaneously need to be undertaken to make the change. The Green Revolution means transformation of agriculture from subsistence to commercial farming, from food insecurity to food surplus, from own production for the household to production for the market. The second is the health revolution. There is simply no excuse on our planet for 200 out of every 1,000 children dying before they reach their 5th birthday in much of Africa. In the rich world, it's 4 or 5 children per every 1,000 that tragically die before their 5th birthday. In Africa, it's 40 or 50 times that. There's absolutely no reason for this. They're dying of malaria, they're dying of diarrheal disease, they're dying of respiratory infection, of measles, yet there's a vaccine, of parasitic diseases for which there's a 5-cent medicine that you take once a year to get deworm. It's cosmically surreal. And yet it goes on as if it's the natural backdrop of the planet. The third revolution I call the connectivity revolution. That is basically harking back to Adam Smith, who rightly pointed out 230 years ago. Yes, it is 230 years ago, 1776 till now. 230 years ago that what makes for productivity is being connected to markets. And Smith was very, very clever. That's a hell of a good book. And people should not only quote Smith, but actually read the book, because it's also a fun book to read. Smith, which is not remembered today, talked about two things. What Adam Smith talked about that we remember today is he said, don't set up artificial barriers to markets, because it's being in markets that leads to the division of labor and productivity, and that's through trade. We each get to specialize, and then I can benefit from your specialization, you can benefit from my specialization. We're each highly productive, but if we had to depend on ourselves for everything we need, we'd never be able to specialize and we'd never be able to be productive. So he said, don't set up artificial barriers to trade, and I rather believe that open trade really is the best policy for the world, for the United States, and for poor countries as well. But he also said something very clever, which almost nobody cites, and I'm trying to bring back into general circulation. He said that physically, if you're isolated from markets, that's the same thing. If you have no roads, if you don't have navigable rivers, if you're far in the interior of a continent, it's as if you've put up a tariff barrier around yourself also, because you face these tremendous costs of transport. And so if you're disconnected from markets through physical geography, it's like being disconnected from markets through protectionism. But he's never quoted on that except by me, I think, frankly. And I've put him in a lot of articles recently to remind people that he actually said that the interior of Africa is the poorest part of the world. And he said that 230 years ago. He said because there are no navigable rivers into the continent. And he said you don't have these great gulfs like you do in Europe that bring people out to the coastline. Most of Africa's population indeed lives in the interior. And the road situation, the transport. But now it's different in a way, although you still need roads and you still need rail to carry mass commodity items like fertilizer in or like grains out. But now we also have, which we didn't have in Smith's day, we have motor transport, and we have rail transport, and we have the internet, and we have cell phones, and we have every other mode of transport and communications that's the miracle of our age. These things are also not available typically to the poorest of the poor, but they could easily be brought to bear. Beatrice's goat could also be a cell phone for a village. And I'm watching how cell phones are making profound changes. And most of the places we're working right now in Africa, interestingly, the cell phone works almost everywhere, but no one has a cell phone. They work because there's a tower 5 or 10 miles away and you're in line of sight, and you put up your BlackBerry and you can make your international calls, no problem. But there's no cell phone in the village, and that's very tragic because when the child is dying or when the mother is dying in childbirth, there's no one to call for the one truck that may be somewhere around, or there's no way to call for a referral to a hospital or to get other emergency needs met. But a cell phone actually for 1 per 1,000 could make a huge difference. And we're working on creating ambulance networks out of the few trucks that are around, that they would be on call as ambulances if the truck driver has a cell phone, and if a community health worker, there's my cell phone, if a community health worker has a cell phone, and you can do absolutely marvelous things right now. So, okay, let me not take up all of your time. Let me run through just a couple of quick things to show you very quickly. Yeah. The bottom line, the purple line, is food output per person in Africa over the last 45 years. And the blue line is in India, and the yellow line is in the world, and the green line is essentially China, plus the rest of Southeast Asia. Now, what you're seeing there is Africa's going hungry, where the rest of the world is growing food, increasing food production faster than population increase. So Africa's in a kind of Malthusian crisis of population growing ahead of food production, whereas the other parts of the world are growing more food per person each year, aside from some squiggles that often have to do with the rainfall shortage in a particular year. Why is this? If you go one more slide, I'll show you the basic point. This is the yield. That means how much is grown per hectare. And this is measured in kilograms per hectare. In Africa, yields have been flat for almost 40 years, basically almost 50 years now, or 45 years. There's been almost no increase of cereal production per hectare. Whereas in the rest of the world, you've achieved what's called a green revolution. Huge increases of the yields, not just more food, but more food per hectare. Why is that? Basically, more intensive agriculture, more fertilizer, more irrigation, better seed varieties. So it's a modernization of agriculture that allows you to grow more food per hectare. And the problem is in Africa, which is the bottom line, if you go to the next slide, just as go to one more. And this is how much fertilizer is put in per hectare in different parts of the world. And in Africa, there's almost no fertilizer put in. This is an example of what I call the poverty trap. The poor are so poor they can't afford fertilizer. Because they can't afford fertilizer, they can't grow enough crops to actually get out of poverty. and they are in a downward spiral of worsening poverty. This, we don't have time to dwell on the numbers, but the tiny fertilizer that's actually put in crops in Africa, it's not even on the food. It's put on the coffee, the cocoa, and the tea. It's not put in the food. So in food production, essentially zero fertilizer input. And the tragedy is these terribly low yields. But if you flip back 3 slides, I'll show you the good news. Okay. This is a measurement of what's actually being produced in 9 countries. 1/2 ton per hectare of cereal or grain yield. But this is what the research stations are producing right now. They're producing about 4 tons per hectare of food. What's the difference? On the research station sites, they use fertilizer, they use the best option seed, and they use small-scale irrigation. So what the on-station evidence is what farmers could produce if they could get best option technology. And it's about 8 times more than they're actually producing. Africa could feed itself, is the bottom line, if basic inputs were available. Now, my whole theory is it's like the goat. If we helped to prime the pump by helping these farmers start to meet their own food needs and then to transform their agriculture to help with this perhaps 5 or 8-fold increase of productivity, they could get on their way through their own saving and capital accumulation. But if you start so poor that you can't even get into the game, you're trapped in a downward spiral rather than in an upward dynamic. So this is the essence of what I'm recommending. Let's help farmers grow enough food, not just send them food aid. Let's help them grow enough food. Let's do it for a few years so that they can also get into cash crops. They can have the time for tree orchards to take hold. They can have the time for spice shrubs and trees to grow, so that then they can become part of the market economy. And if we just are leaving them at the brink of survival and shipping food aid rather than helping to grow the food, we're not going to break out of the downward spiral. One more example, and then I really am going to stop, because I go on a whole semester on this. Actually, let's talk about that just for one moment. This is just, I just want to put it in your thoughts. This is the actual average rainfall in the Sahel, which is one of the driest places in the world. And that black line is the historical average, and you can kind of see there's a downward trend, although a lot of irregularity as well. And what this paper is about is the idea that there is a downward trend in the Sahel caused by global climate change. And while it's a debated proposition, it's becoming increasingly accepted that it's the global shocks that are leading to these local rainfall declines. Now, it's not sure, but I can tell you surely, because it's important for all your future work, we are in the middle already of global climate change. This isn't a debate for 20 years from now or 30 years from now. It's now. It's now. And this is going to be part of the real life. The Hurricane Katrinas are here for the foreseeable future because we've warmed up the Caribbean. And because of the other changes that are underway, we've created conditions for drought in places that are desperately in need of rainfall. So the vulnerabilities have increased, and we have to be even more clever than before through all sorts of means. One, we should strengthen the levees, and should have done that before. Second, we have to understand the physical risks and the financial risks, and think about insurance in various ways as well. So, not to belabor the point, part of this rainfall issue could, and is increasingly likely seeming to be man-made in this ironic way. Okay, one more word. malaria, which you saw at the beginning, is a disease that's related to tropical climate. So if you go to the next picture, this is a study that I did with a number of colleagues at Harvard a few years ago of asking where are the environmental conditions for malaria most dangerous for malaria transmission. And what shows up unequivocally is Africa. That is the place where malaria transmission intrinsically is likely to be most dangerous. This is part of a differential diagnosis. Africa's malaria is not because they don't care, not because they haven't tried, but because the underlying conditions, and this is the kind of mosquitoes, the temperature, the rainfall, are all leading to terribly intense malaria transmission. And what this suggests is we have to make extra special efforts to control this disease in this environment. Fortunately, we have technologies to do it now. Bed nets and improved medicines and other techniques. And but we haven't been doing it. And there are a whole host of other diseases, if you flip to the next picture, really ugly, awful stuff with all these awful names like dracunculiasis, which is African guinea worm, which is the disease that President Carter has been doing so much to lead the fight against. Trypanosomiasis, reading from the bottom, this is African sleeping sickness. Onchocerciasis is African river blindness. Lymphatic filariasis is what's sometimes called elephantiasis. Trachoma is a blinding disease. And then all of these are worm infections, trichuriasis, schistosomiasis, ascariasis, and hookworm. And the poorest of the poor are living with all of these. Many poor children have 5 of these diseases infecting them at one time. And the distended bellies are often not from undernutrition, but from physical presence of worms. And one pill once a year it doesn't solve the problem forever, it just takes out the worms that are coming because the children are wading in water or drinking water that has the parasites in them. But if you do it once a year at school, then you raise the health level and lower the infection load tremendously. These pills cost 5 cents. We're not organized to do it. If the President of the United States said, I'm going after these 7 diseases, and in partnership with the leading drug companies, all of these diseases could be reduced 90% plus within a year or 2. No problem. No problem, actually. Because the enthusiasm in the recipient countries would be so huge, you'd have a mass social mobilization. Because Rotary International would jump up and say, we'll do that. Because Heifer International would jump up and say, we'll put that into our programs. Because CARE and Opportunity International and everyone else would jump up and say, we can do that also. Because if we tried, rather than leaving the poorest of the poor to their suffering, actually, we'd find an incredible resonance to do something about it. But we're not doing it right now. So one more point, and then truly, if you keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. One more, one more, one more. There. What we are doing right now, in addition to my trying to talk about this and think about it and try to involve as many people as possible, is that on the basis substantially of private philanthropy, like Heifer International, we're taking up the challenge of helping village by village to make green revolutions, health revolutions, and connectivity revolutions. And it's a project we call the Millennium Villages Project. Maybe it's a project that with Heifer International and the Clinton School for Public Service, maybe we could actually find some partners around here to do, and I will discuss that with David and with Heifer International, because there's actually a phenomenal tremendous educational potential here. This is clinical economics like I've never seen. And for me, I'm back in grad school because my learning curve is, I'm a city boy. What do I know about farming? What do I know about these worm infections? It's all seeing it, talking to experts, being on the ground, learning about these things. It's the most phenomenal possible education. So what we've been doing is finding partners, finding philanthropists to invest $1.5 million over 5 years for a village of 5,000 people. And that enables a transformation of the entire village, because basically it is the goat. That's the point. Small things make such a profound difference, and I'm seeing it now with my own eyes, and I always kind of knew it, and I studied it, and I costed it, and I made spreadsheets, and I made recommendations. Now I'm seeing it in the faces, in the soils, in the fields, in the most direct way. This was one of the most amazing days of my life, this meeting, which is in a village community in western Kenya, which is written about in the book. Actually, the book writes about this community. The book doesn't. I write about it in this book. And I learned more in 5 hours than frankly, I had in a lot of time. And the reason was that I knew conceptually a lot of things, but when we got about 250 people together in the room and spent a whole afternoon together, I learned a couple of amazing things firsthand, very directly. First, the amount of social capital in these villages just blew my mind, because they're so impoverished, and yet they're organized as communities. And I said something about the importance of electricity. And a man stood up somewhere in the middle and said, "Professor, I'm the chairman of the electricity committee." And I said, "But there's no electricity here." And he said, "Well, we were promised in 1997 electricity, so they asked us to form a committee." And the rest of the electricity committee stood up. Now, in a way, it was poignant, funny, sad, but actually, for me, it was extraordinarily revealing about the society in the village. First, the patients, but second, the organization. Because there's actually an agriculture committee, there's an electricity committee, there's a water committee, there's a school committee, there's a health committee. They have nothing. But they're trying to solve their problems. They just have no tools. But once there's a generator, then there's the electricity committees responsible for its management. Or if there's fertilizer, then the agriculture committee is responsible for how the fertilizer can be honestly distributed to every household without anyone stealing it. And if there's the water committee, it's where to put the 12 improved water points around the village, because you need a community mechanism to make some of these choices. And we're finding this incredible structure everywhere in Africa, where people, it's not just poverty, it's people. And it's not inert people. It's people that they're alive, and they're alive to their reality, and they're alive to their situation, and they want partnership to help them do something, of course. But they're ready to take the lead, they're ready to work round the clock, and they need tools. They need the goat. They need the generator. They need the bed nets. They need the fertilizer. They need the improved seed. They don't need a lot. And this is the transformation that one can see before their eyes, before one's own eyes. I had the conversation with them that was also incredibly illuminating. I asked them, how many of you sleep under how many of you sleep under a bed net to fight malaria? First, I asked them, how many of you have someone in your household that has had malaria this year? And there were it was translated, then laughter in the room, because every hand went up in the room, every hand, because malaria is everywhere. It's super infection, meaning multiple malaria parasites in the blood from multiple bites. It's what's called holoendemic, meaning it's just pervasive. children are parasitized year-round, even if they don't get clinical cases all the time. So that was the first thing. Then I said to them, how many of you have a bed net to sleep under? About 3 hands or 5 hands went up in this whole gathering. So there's a lot of mythology about these bed nets. Oh, they're given away, they're too hot to sleep under, doesn't fit the culture. Oh, they're cut up for wedding veils, they're used as fishing nets. This is the kind of 50-font nonsense that circulates around town. I heard it in Washington again yesterday. It's utterly preposterous. So, but anyway, I said maybe they don't like them. How many of you would like a bed net? No, at first I said, wait, how many of you have a bed net? No, second I said, how many of you know about bed nets? Because maybe they'd never heard of them. Every hand shot up. Also, you want to check that your translation is making sense. So I'd like to go slow and have a detailed conversation. How many of you have heard of bed nets? Everybody. And somebody said, yes, you know, somewhere over there was an experiment with, but all of us know about bed nets. How many of you would like a bed net? Every hand stayed up. So then this woman, right there, stood up and through the translator said, sir, we can't afford bed nets. Just, it's as simple as that. And then murmurs around the room. And at that moment, I learned how to be a mayor, be elected mayor in Africa, because, of course, I said, we commit, everybody will have a bed net. Cheers! And it's an exciting moment, you know. I love a little dose of populism in this. And it's part of our project that we don't think you should sell bed nets to people without money, but we believe you actually give them out. And we have mobilized a company, the one that produces long-lasting insecticide-treated nets, Sumitomo Chemical Company, and they've given us a donation of 336,000 bed nets to hand out to every sleeping site in the 100 villages where we're working around Africa. So this, and it takes 1 day to get the entire village covered. It takes 1 day to cover 50,000 people. If you're doing this in a plan of a whole region, it can be 1 million people in 1 day, because all it takes is volunteers going house to house counting. So the young children sleep there, the father sleeps there, the 10-year-old and the 9-year-old sleep there, and you say, okay, 3 nets, here's how you hang them. Now, in our village, everybody has kept the nets, used the nets, and the malaria has dropped incredibly. Why not? You know, this idea that, oh, only the rich say if people don't pay, they won't. Only the rich say about the poor, I should say, that only when you pay do you make value of it, because the rich love their tax cuts for free. They don't want to pay anything. But they say about the poor, no, you have to charge them, otherwise they won't take care. That's the famous view. Yeah.
How do you respond as an economist, and maybe also from a moral standpoint, because it seems like to you some of this is, you know, almost a moral issue, and
Yes.
when you say, like, there's no reason why this can't be done, how do you respond to the assertion or the idea that in some ways, by sort of increasing all, that the Earth has this sort of population
Yeah.
stability level, and at some point we're going to hit that to where the Earth isn't going to be able to,
Right.
to sustain itself at all, and that while this is a short-term solution, if every village in Africa has a well, the water is going to disappear at some point, and
Right.
so you're just delaying the
Right.
inevitable when the Earth won't be able to have enough water or enough food to support everyone.
Where do you think the population grows fastest, in the rich countries or the poor countries?
In the rich countries. In the poor countries.
By far in the poor countries. Because in the rich countries, people choose lower fertility levels.
Right.
So the way out of the population trap is economic development.
Sure, but
So, Can you go further with that?
So the first point is that these places right now have what's called a total fertility rate, which is the statistical average of number of children per mother, around 6 or 7. And if you think about what that means, it's maybe 2 of those children will not survive. And if it's 6, then a mother will have 4 surviving children. On average, 2 of them will be daughters. Each mother will have 2 surviving daughters. That means that every generation the population will double. That's a disaster. That's exactly what's happening right now. In rich countries, the total fertility rate is 2 or less. That means that on average, each mother is replacing herself in a biological sense with 1 daughter on average, or even on average, at this point, less in Europe. There's a slight population decline. That change is called the demographic transition. It's extremely important for the planet. It comes mainly by choice of households saying, we only want 3 children, we only want 2 children, family planning, contraception. That's the dominant change that's underway in the planet. Where it's not happening is the poorest of the poor. Why? Because it costs money, because there are no clinics, there's no contraceptive availability, because when children die with high probabilities, parents don't choose to have fewer children. Because when mothers are having 6 or 7 children, they don't work in the labor force, so the value of their time in a market sense is much reduced. And so when they have a market opportunity, then the time cost of raising children goes up and they choose to have fewer children as well. When women are illiterate, they generally are having more children than when they're literate. So girls' education is another factor. So I believe that it's important for the planet to reach a stable population, but to reach it not through people dying of starvation, but to reach it through economic development. We're actually probably on a course of stabilization of the world's population. The UN estimates that that'll happen in the year 2071 right now. That's the medium forecast of the UN Population Division. It peaks at 9.1 billion. We're at 6.5 billion right now. So that would be adding 2.6 billion people. That's too much. And that transition could come a lot faster if we actually invest in child survival. That will actually speed the stabilization of the population, because the drop of fertility will be even faster than the drop of mortality. That's the lesson all over the world. Child survival, girls' education, women's empowerment, economic opportunity. And you could get the fertility rates by choice down enormously in a short period of time. That, I think, is important. Now, there's another part of the question, which isn't about population, but is about income levels. And about, let's say that you reach a stable population. What about the level of each person's consumption in that stable population? Aren't we going to eat ourselves out of the planet? Aren't we going to... Now, I believe 2 things about this. First, the ecological footprint of the rich, so-called, or the ecological footprint, so-called, of the rich, to get the punctuation right, is much higher than the ecological footprint of the poor. An order of magnitude or more higher. So I don't want to balance the Earth's sustainability on the deaths of the poor. I think that that's not the right way to look at it. The biggest transformations that are taking place are through the heavy burden that the rich are imposing in the energy that we're using, in the fish that we're feeding ourselves, in the tropical logging, and in many other things, though population goes right up there as another factor. So we need to find sustainable ways for the planet to allow the poor to get richer. ideally without the rich having to get poorer. But I don't want to say, sorry, we're going to live the way we're living, so it's not right to help these people. I think that's neither analytically right, nor do I believe it's a viable answer, nor do I believe it's going to save us from the real ecological problems that we ourselves are doing the most to contribute to, like the global climate change. We're actually impacting them vastly more than they're impacting us. So that's another talk, and it's my next book, actually, which is about sustainable development. I believe, just like I believe with extreme poverty, that if we think about these issues in a very hard-headed, knowledge-based but practical way, we actually can square the circle of having higher incomes in the world and environmental sustainability. We just need to be a lot smarter about it. And the answer is not to drill oil in the Alaska Wildlife Reserve. And it's not to say, we're so desperate for the next 6 months of oil, we'll take that anywhere. Or we don't want to lose any of our GNP, so we'll continue with the climate change and have more Hurricane Katrinas in the future. It's rather to think really carefully about what our options are. It's more sustainable energy systems. It's more efficient water use. It is population stabilization, exactly what you've said. It's aquaculture rather than open fishing in the oceans. It's learning to love it's learning to love vegetarian fish more than carnivorous fish. So a little bit more tilapia and carp and a little bit less salmon, because that'll actually help sustain the oceans more. It's much more intelligent ways to raise cattle, and rather than mass extensive pasture land farming, because we will eat ourselves out of house and home at the way we're going, but it's mainly the rich world that's and the rise of China and India and so forth that's going to put incredible demands on the planet. So I think your instinct is right completely. This is a real issue. I would say that even at today's level of economic activity, we are not sustainable in what we're doing. We're not holding our own on the planet right now, even just where we are. And yet, it's likely that there'll be a lot more people and a lot more economic activity. But it's not the poorest of the poor that need to die for our sins. And it's they're not the ones that are making, and it's not even sins, let me get the language exactly right, for our consumption. And it's probably also not the case that we have to impoverish ourselves in order to find sustainability. We just have to be a lot smarter. And we have to not duck the issue and pretend it's not there. That's the biggest mistake we're making. The president doesn't want to look at this because he thinks he's going to lose the votes in West Virginia if he talks about greenhouse gases and coal. But if he were better advised, then he'd understand that there are technologies to use coal safely and that would do a lot less climate damage. And he'd be promoting those much more actively. And he'd be leading rather than ducking the issues. And so that's, I think, the answer. You're exactly right, but let's not do it through this kind of suffering, because it won't work. Everything needs some arithmetic. And the arithmetic is, even if every one of these people has enough water and electricity, doesn't change the global equation. We're still unsustainable. And their having it doesn't make us even much of an iota more unsustainable. It's actually the development and the rich that need to be more effective in their own use of the resources.
When you're talking about actually, the practical impact on communities, what are you doing to make sure that we're not messing with, an internal community's systems already? I think about, I'm from eastern Nebraska.
Yeah.
you know, my family had its farm for over 100 years.
Right.
But specialization has made it pretty much impossible to be a small farmer
Right.
in the United States.
Yep.
And is that the model that we're trying to impose so that, I mean, because it does tend to break down communities and push urbanization.
Right.
And I mean, I would hate to have that American model necessarily imposed. I mean, that's something that we talk about every day as, you know, as leaders, when we go into communities.
Right.
Are we imposing our values?
Right.
Our thoughts? I mean,
I
how
think
is
that,
being?
yeah, I think there are two or maybe three, actually probably three things to say. You won't necessarily like all of them. Because I think that there are some realities here that are probably not ideal from some points of view. But first, a basic point. The standard of the actual approach that we're taking is there are no expatriates doing any of the work in the villages. So the villages are in the lead of anything that actually gets done inside. And I think that's a good standard. We're, in our work and in the kind of work I recommend, we're guests of someone else's society. I never for a moment want to think otherwise. And so we're there to partner with them. We're not there to dictate to them. And we can't anyway. And since we're not there actually building the huts or putting in the fertilizer, treating a patient, all we're doing is bringing in tools for them to do it. There's a limit to how intrusive we can be anyway, and I rather like that limit for the reason you're saying. So that's point number one.
But you said it's expatriates, so it's people who've gone out to get the education.
I'm sorry. No. Let me say it right. What I said, if I didn't say it right, I said there are no expats, meaning there are none of us there. All the work is by the villagers and by locals, and even we hire people for the project, but they're local people that are the project managers. Heifer has the same principle. So that's one point. So I do feel that everything we do is not to overdetermine someone else's fate. But these people want help, and they're pretty desperate, and they're grateful for the help. But the second point I was going to make is sometimes it's said we're going to change their development, would change their culture. That's true. I'm not I do not believe in unchanging culture. One of the cultural aspects in almost every traditional society where I've worked is rampant subservience of women in social status. I don't believe in it. I see it both as I can see its deep roots in the nature of traditional society, especially if a woman's biological role is to have 6 or 7 or 8 children. It's not surprising that she's doing certain things in the home and not doing certain things outside. And since I don't think that that's the way that the world's likely to be or even useful for people under current conditions, I think that the role of women is going to change a lot. I have no hesitation in myself in saying that the changes we're helping with will empower the women in the village and in relative terms disempower the men. You know, probably there are traditional chiefs that don't like the fact that the women come onto the committees or are doing this or doing that. I am very comfortable with that. So just a lot of people, I'm not from a cultural point of view a preservationist, because I don't know of a culture that doesn't change. And whether it's religious culture, whether it's social culture, and in particular, I believe in women's empowerment, and I actually believe in cultural change as something to encourage. So that's a second issue. Third, I can say as an economist, economic change is not just having more of something, it's living in different places, doing different things for one's life. And in the United States, 200 years ago, 80% of the population were farmers. Now, 1% of the population is farmers. That's what your family's experiencing. that comes from the fact of the incredible productivity of American farming. Because basically, 1% of the population can feed 110% of the population, because it feeds us plus a lot of the rest of the world. That the underlying core economic logic of that is that the share of the population in farming goes down sharply. That's the model that I have in mind for almost any place in the world as success.
What I guess.
And in India, the share of urbanization is going way up. Why? Because as soon as one farm household isn't just feeding itself, but is feeding its neighbor, then you can be sure that the share of the labor force in agriculture is going to go down to 50%. Once one farmer can feed 5 households, it's going to go down to 20%. And that's basic economics, which I approve of in a way. And I'm a pretty generous person, so I don't mean to be at all snide about it. I believe in a social welfare system. I believe in helping people make transitions. I believe in, but I don't believe in no change.
Right. I guess my question was really about specialization.
Yep.
Though, if we keep going down the specialization model, that creates that whole urbanization process much faster than when farms are diversified.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a completely unviable economic model?
No, and in the first year of this village, we helped them grow maize, but in the second year, they're growing 10 crops. So actually, a good model of proper tropical agriculture anyway is not monoculture. It's diversification, but it won't stop this story. If you look at a map of urbanization against income level, you'll see it's almost a straight line. And it's a very powerful rising trend. And let me suggest another thing you could graph. And if I'm wrong, let me know. Do a scatter plot of, say, child mortality rates on the x-axis and urbanization on the y-axis. And you'll also find that there's a negative relationship there. As high urbanization is associated with low child mortality, low urbanization with high child mortality. That's not causation. That is to say that the transformations that lead to more survival are the same transformations that lead to urbanization. It's not that children are safer in cities, although there's a bit of that because the clinic's more accessible typically. It's that economic transformation, economic development is really part and parcel of urbanization, or urbanization is part and parcel of economic development. And the reason is that the basic, deep economic reason is that most economic activity benefits from face-to-face contact. And just about the only kind that doesn't is face-to-land contact. So and that means that agriculture needs large spaces and low population densities, but industry and services need high densities. So people move to cities when they're not farmers, because if you're going to be an investment banker, it's hard to do it alone. If you're going to be a healthcare provider, it's hard to do it in a rural area. And so the natural change is to cities. And you're in a generation and in a family and coming from a place that's seeing that transition right now. But most of America has gone through that in the last 100 years. Sometimes painfully, sometimes because of great opportunities of the children.
David Lambert is our guest today. David, you're
Fortunate to be
familiar
with the
this
class
program.
again. Thank you, and pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Great.
In an ideal world, you and the Major General you talked about would be a few feet away from the Oval Office giving that advice. Are you encouraged to think within the power structure of our government there is any good advice going like yours? And what are the sources, if there may be?
I had a great time in Washington yesterday, which is unusual for me, unfortunately. But I had a wonderful meeting in the evening, which I hope will turn into something useful, at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a new initiative of the government, which I have been very critical of for its slow start. There's a new head of it, Ambassador John Danilovich, and we had a terrific time yesterday. I was feeling good about showing him these slides, and he was feeling good about the role that the Millennium Challenge Corporation might play in an African green revolution. So we started to talk about some very practical things. That was heartening. And his staff emailed me the contacts in 6 African countries to pursue the discussion on a very practical level, and my staff and colleagues have called out to these countries today, so we're trying to get something moving. That's the good news. The bad news is that until recently, at least, our country has been asleep at the switch in this. It's been 25 years of decline of this effort. And the 90s, we had a decline of foreign aid during the Clinton administration. I know the president says that, through a Republican Congress, he couldn't get things through. I've believed all along, unproven, that this is a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue, that we ought to be able to reach everybody with some good explanations. And now President Clinton is really leading on this tremendously, and I think he's going to help turn the tide also. I believe fundamentally we got on a bad track, especially after September 11, because I felt that the first words that I heard afterwards, war on terror, and Tom Friedman in the New York Times calling it World War III, was disastrously wrong. That, was almost impossible to say for a while. I think the whole concept of the war on terror is wrong. And I think the Iraq War has been one of the worst foreign policy debacles for our country in this generation, or the worst since Vietnam. So that has made it very hard to be heard in any serious way. Interesting things are happening right now. A lot of the religious right, if I could call it that, is really getting on board on these issues. A lot of the evangelical community is getting on board on these issues. The person that I've worked most closely with on malaria control by far is Senator Brownback. We probably, fortunately, haven't gone through a detailed checklist of all the things we agree on and those things we don't agree on, but we agreed right at the beginning to agree vigorously on malaria control. And he's been wonderful helping me, get through different parts of the bureaucracy and so on. And I have long believed that this kind of bipartisan effort is absolutely feasible in the country. But I'll tell you just an exact little vignette of this. I spent several months, I've spent many years trying to get malaria control higher on the screen, and I will pat myself on the back for some contributions to the effort. It's not been for naught. And I, with Kofi Annan, wrote the plan for this thing called the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, and that is now funding some of this effort. But as a macroeconomist, my main job is arithmetic and spreadsheets to try to understand the scale of the challenges and how much they cost and what to do about them. And so I've worked a long time on costing malaria control and know that it should be about $3 billion a year if we're going to get the bed nets out, the medicines out, the diagnostics out, the community health workers. So I spent a lot of last spring and summer trying to get the White House interested in malaria control, and talked to Bob Zellick many times, and talked to the National Security Council many times, and talked about $3 billion, of which the U.S. could be $1 billion, and we'd mobilize the other $2 billion from other partners in all of this. Senator Brownback, helped get all of this in front of the head of OMB and the senior staff of OMB and so forth. So we found each and every way. President went to the G8 summit and he announced a malaria initiative. And I know that it was some of this prodding that made a difference. But they announced $1.2 billion over 5 years rather than $1 billion a year. Probably because I'm not good enough politician, I can't give them credit because I'm too pained by the arithmetic of it. 1.2 billion is 21 hours of Pentagon spending per year, because we're spending 1.4 billion on the Pentagon right now per day. So they couldn't do more than a day's Pentagon spending for a 5-year program. To me, that's really a wrong orientation for the country, deeply wrong. So my metric is in Pentagon days, and I think we're just way off track in our military approach to things. And in this sense, I'm not sure the White House can get off of it, not this White House, because in the end they announced something. They're quite proud of it, actually. You know, I said in the White House in February 2001, AIDS will be good politics for you if you do something on AIDS control. This is not dangerous politics. 2 years later, they announced the same program I handed them on February 2001, a $3 billion a year program. And it turned out to be terrific politics for them in one sense. I don't know how terrific, but the president mentions it dozens or hundreds of times. Obviously, he's proud of it himself, I know that. But he also thinks it's good to show compassionate conservatism. So I don't believe this is dangerous at all. I think, though, that tax cuts of $250 billion a year and increased military spending of $250 billion a year has left us in a real mess. Yeah.
I mean, from that discussion, and when I was a political science major in my undergraduate work, and the most simple, some say oversimplified, definition of political science is who gets what, when,
Right.
where, and why.
We claim that for economics, too.
Okay.
But anyway, it used to be called political economy, so it's...
And I listened to you give us the statistics about the problem with extreme poverty and hunger in Africa and other areas, and I even think about the poverty here, although
Yep.
not so extreme, and then there's this void of why.
Right.
And obviously, even if we don't find the specific reason, part of the solution is redefining or changing the paradigm.
Yes, exactly.
Which obviously
That's
is controlled
exactly
by
right.
the politics. So I'm wondering what you see as that part of the
Good.
solution in redefining that paradigm.
Good.
And the second part of my question, so I can be done.
Right.
Is I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the role that religion and colonialism has played globally
Mhm.
on poverty, and then racism has played on poverty in this country.
Good. Okay, great. You said that we have to change the paradigm, but the paradigm is controlled by the politics. The more I live my life and the more I get into this, the more I believe that the politics is controlled by the paradigm rather than the paradigm controlled by the politics. And I'm more and more interested, maybe in a surprising way for me, more and more interested in changing hearts and minds than in the exact legislative enactment for the moment. We need both. Of course, I'm interested in the legislative enactment. I'd take it today if we could get it. But what I mean by that is that I think that there really is a case for helping people to understand better choices, the choices we're making, what we could do with the money that we have, the taxes, with our resources, with our efforts, and that there does need to be an ongoing public discussion of these issues, because fundamentally we need to change how we view our security and how we view our relations with the rest of the world and how we view others, other societies. And I see this kind of, I think this end of poverty is going to be, as I say in the last chapter of my book, like the civil rights movement, or like the anti-colonial movement, or like the movement to end slavery. These were mass movements that engaged people at the deepest level. They weren't narrow economic calculations, but there was pressure, there was protest, there was public demonstration, there was public awareness, there was appeal to morality, there was appeal to religious injunction. All of those things went into broader social change. And I think that that's what's needed here also. I believe that we have the wrong approach to the world in this country right now, in the sense that we view the world as somehow rigid categories of us versus them. There's us, and then there are Islamic terrorists. And they're there because they're following rigidly their commands, and we're doing whatever we're doing, and we're in a struggle for survival. I regard this way of looking at the world as completely flawed. What we are and what they are and how we relate depends on how we relate to them and how we relate to other societies. I don't think anything is set in stone. I don't think there's such thing as even such thing as a fundamentalist society, or such thing as a terrorist society, certainly not. I think that people are in positions of desperation, or in positions of confusion, or in positions of complete disinformation or misinformation, and that I bemoan how little we talk to each other in the world, for example. If I were trying to resolve the Iran thing, I'd actually meet with the head of Iran. This we're not allowed to do in this world. That's a sign of weakness. Discussion is viewed as a terrible sign. Rather than bombing Saddam, I'd actually have tried to sit down with Saddam. This is viewed as nuts, weak, big mistake, appeasement. We learned all the wrong lessons from one event, Munich, 1938, when Chamberlain met with Hitler. And since that time, you can't meet with your foe. That's appeasement. That's actually tactically a disastrous mistake, because we're so ignorant of these places. I can't even stress to you how little we know. And so it doesn't surprise me that we can't do anything right in Iraq, because it's shocking how little was known. And we never talked. So anyway, I'm getting off the subject. I think that the point is to change the minds and to help people understand. And to help people understand the real choices. The Major General came to me, by the way, said, "Can you help me get my message across?" I said, "Oh my God, Major General, me help you get your message across?" He said precisely, "Can you help me get my message across in Washington?" Now that made me nervous. Okay, I'll try, Major General, but this is why. Anyway, I believe we can have a pretty fundamental change of view, and we have to take down the fear factor tremendously, and we have to take up the empathy factor tremendously. That's a very big part of all of this. Fear is really the biggest opponent to action. The fear of the poor is mainly the fear that we're going to somehow get sucked in, and it's, we don't want to be poor, so we don't want to have anything to do with this. Racism plays a tremendous role. There's no question. People are ready to believe things about Africa that know nothing about anything because of racism, in my opinion. There is a very famous psychology experiment, which you probably know about, of the white person mugging the black person in the subway. Have you seen this? It's a very famous psychology test of a picture of a mugging taking place, and a white person has a knife to a black person. And this is shown in many cases to Americans, and 80% say, well, that's a black person mugging a white person, if you do a quick thing and you put it down. And it's the latent racism and stereotyping in our society. And it is a very powerful thing. And at a more abstract level, you say, well, Africa, that's corruption, Bingo. You don't have to know 3 countries in Africa to say that. You can just be sure that's right. And so in my view, that is one of the reasons why we don't look more deeply at this is racism.